So first of all, thank you for letting me share this time with you. It's always a pleasure reconnecting with our colleagues in the cybersecurity and IT risk community. Again, I'm Gerry Owens because I needed to authenticate myself to the introduction. And what a well-written introduction. I'm glad they asked me for it. I didn't think it was going to be read like that, but it's always good to hear about things that you've done for 35 years that you can't actually remember that you did. So we're not going to talk about privileged access management. It's just a deceptive title page that would lure people into listening to me talk endlessly for 40 minutes. So I think I got 25 minutes about different topics around the business community. But what we are going to talk about is really a business culture and organizational principles and management that allows companies to become better adapters of key security programs like privileged access. And so when you think about privileged access in general, that's not my house. See if I can work a laptop, it's easier that way. There we go. So there are a number of passions that I've had grown over the number of years that I've been in the banking industry. And as the three come together, it's become clear to me as the industry has matured around IT security programs in companies like large banks, like large insurance companies, and in fact, industry in general. The three passions that actually come together would be around the role that identity plays in an organization, and in particular, how privileged access truly secures the enterprise. The second would be around an IT risk strategy, an IT risk framework that allows you not only to inform your investments in technology, but also helps build your strategy to determine what controls and business processes you put in place that secures your company. And the third is what I would call organizational capability. And that brings together two very discrete disciplines. One would be around project management, which I call the disruptor, and the other would be around organizational change management, which I've characterized as your transformation. And the two have to operate together in order to be successful. And when you think about where the industry is going, privileged access management, and I know there was a conference that was held not too long ago that probably had a lot of data around privileged access management. And it probably talked about things like the Forbes magazines that would have reported that over 80% of breaches had something to do with abuse of a privileged credential. And so the reason we're here today is not to talk about why privileged access management is a program that's essential for the industry, but to talk about what strategies would we incorporate in order to make sure that privileged access management becomes a cultural entity within a large organization. It's not just about technology, it's really about business processes. And so the industry now has recognized that privileged access management needs to be something that companies start to take more seriously. It needs to align to your cybersecurity strategy. It needs to be a main tenet of your IT risk strategy, and there needs to be a way to implement it so that the investment in the controls that you implement are truly commensurate with the level of risk you're trying to protect. But there are some ultimate great misconceptions, and I'm going to try this button again. There are some great misconceptions around I'm going to jettison the controls. There are some great misconceptions around what privileged access management really is. It is not just a technology initiative. If you look at it as a software and technology initiative, you're probably going to find yourself being measured against something that's really hard to sustain in an organization. And by the way, I think the most important point to be made around privileged access, it is not a technology problem. It is not a security problem. It's truly a business problem. And the quicker businesses really start to understand that, the more they will position themselves to a successful implementation that can be sustained over a number of years along the enterprise, and certainly long after the project moves away. It's not a simple construction project, so you don't plan it over 3 months, drop it in, and then the project team runs away. It's a multi-year program, and it's a multi-year program that creates significant impact and disruption, not just to the technology, but to the business operating model that it's being implemented within. And by that, it's not just the people that are responsible for supporting the environments that have a new way of gathering passwords when they have to enter the systems that they support, but it's really how the organization starts to look at privileged access as well and what that really means. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as we talk this afternoon. And then lastly, PAM does not stand alone. And so it needs to be a fundamental integrated component of your cybersecurity strategy. That's clear, and I think most of the people in this room have enough experience in the industry that that isn't new news to you. But in addition to that, it also has to be aligned to your access management strategy. Because as important as privileged access is to your organization, and as detrimental as it could be if it's in the wrong hands, if credentials are stolen or they're abused, the reality is that it is just simply a series of elevated roles in a digital identity schema across your organization to start with. And so it can't operate alone, it should never operate alone. It needs to be integrated with both your cybersecurity strategy as well as your IAM strategy. So having said that, the industry has done a fair amount of work in maturing how privileged access management would originate within an organization. But there's more work that needs to be done. And there's nothing here that I would suggest to you are tenets that would be new or things that you haven't heard before. But I would advocate, though, there are some strong disciplines that are required in order to have a successful implementation that aren't necessarily being captured across the industry, whether you're in the financials, the insurance, which in today's world have become incredibly blurred in terms of their demarcation points, whether you're talking utilities, airlines, wherever you have data assets that could create a substantial impact to society as a result of breach. And so there's really four main tenets around how we would define a successful PAM program. And when you look through this, you will see that I spend very little time talking about the technology associated with a privileged access solution. And while your decision in a technology is critical and it's important, it's an enabler. It's there to drive the business capabilities that you are in fact trying to implement across a large organization, or a medium organization, or a small organization. It's actually the same, perhaps arguably a bit more complex. And so it really starts with your business strategy. It really starts with defining a very clear definition of your program objectives. What are the things that we think we need to do, and what does privileged access mean when we talk about implementing this type of program? And so let's think about that for a minute, because it's a very simple series of statements, and it actually looks almost, to some extent, aspirational. But when you really start to look at how you want your organization to behave, it's fundamentally important to understand what your strategy is going to look like. And you need to ask yourself a question. If I look at where I am today, and I want to step aside and I want to look at where I need to be within a year, perhaps 2 years, what does that model need to look like? And what do I need to define in my program to go from where I am today to where I need to be? When you think about privileged access programs itself, you start to contemplate how this is going to impact my organization. How am I protecting our data assets that we said are high value to the organization? In some cases, they've started to call those your crown jewels or your digital crown jewels. You might look at your organization and say, do we have an insider threat program, and how does that align to that insider threat program, and what sort of things do we need to consider? Do we have an understanding of how many privileged accounts do we have across the organization? And do we know how they actually gain their access to their systems? And do we understand the level of the entitlements that they have that gets access to the systems they support? And is it commensurate with the requirements that they have to provide support? Or have they just continued to bleed through and echo access points every time they've moved across the system administrator organization? And when you look at this, and I've seen in the industry in the past, and some of the clients that we've talked to in the past, and what's interesting is, in many cases, they talked about deploying a strategy around privileged access management, and they talked about implementing either vault technology or multi-factor authentication for those vaults. And what they tend to hear back is, in many of those cases, there's a number of system administrators that would come back and say, well, actually, we didn't need this access in the first place. Don't know why I still have it, but I can tell you, you don't have to invest in any product. And then you go back and you look at your program, your identity and access management, your attestation or recertification, and you kind of wonder why the manager kept attesting to their access when they're telling you in the first place that they didn't need it. And so part of privileged access is looking at your operating model itself. Who's providing this access? What's the governance around it? How many of these IDs do we have across the base? Have we had informed discussions with the CTO in order to make sure that they had a full understanding of their system people that are accessing systems with the privileges that they have? And I can guarantee you they'll be surprised. They're always surprised. shocked, dejected, and they're probably the first to willing to step up and say, okay, let's cut this access. So before you implement technology and you start to put these large, complicated controls around the people of access, you want to be comfortable that you understand who has the access in the first place, how they get the access, and what they support. That then drives into your business case, because when you write your business case around a privileged access program, you need to be clear on what it's going to look like over the next 2 to 3 years, because that's actually what it's going to take. You have to prioritize your implementation to make sure that you can demonstrate to the risk people in your organization that you're continuing to drive down the risk posture within your organization as a result of your implementation. And you also need to understand the environment you're implementing in. One of the biggest assumptions that can kill a strategy is simplifying how you think this thing could be implemented in an organization. And I was in a session earlier, it was Women in Technology, I believe, and they talked about the fact, it was May actually, that said, technology is actually very simple. Technology is not that complicated. And she's actually right. It really isn't that sophisticated. It isn't rocket science. But the implementation complexities that you deal with when you're implementing across a base of multi-organizations and multi-disciplines, that's where the challenge is. And your business case also has to understand and contemplate where that needs to lead to. And then, of course, you have to understand your support requirements. Because ultimately, I think I wouldn't be speaking an untruth if I were to suggest that those of us that are in the cybersecurity field, we actually don't implement anything, right? In many cases, your technology and infrastructure teams are responsible for the implementation. You influence through policy and control requirements what needs to be done, but by and large, in the larger organizations anyway, medium and small organizations may be a bit less diversified, but you don't carry the screwdriver. And so you need to make sure that in your business case, you contemplate what it's going to take for those support teams to implement the technology that you're implementing, but more importantly, the impact that it's going to have on those teams when in fact the product is then in place and it's implemented and things are changing across. Now, as you're defining that business case, it brings us to the next level, the next domain, and that's really around what your overall IT risk program is. So many people have implemented privileged access tools in the past as a result of an audit finding, right? If you look back 10 years, audit would come in and say, you need to vault the passwords and you need some type of mechanism, so you went out and bought a product. And that was okay, because 10 years ago, the threat landscape wasn't the same. In today's world, the threat landscape has evolved. Identity is the new perimeter, and by extension, privileged access is the new firewall. And so this concept of just vaulting passwords and then somebody checking them out and hoping that the thing expires and hasn't shared the password and doesn't have prolonged access to the rest of your infrastructure, those days don't exist anymore, because the controls against those, the vulnerabilities and weaknesses of those, are the very things that are being exploited in the industry today. We can't afford to continue doing that. And so you have a risk control framework, you might have an insider threat program, you clearly have some type of audit and regulatory oversight. So if you're in the banking industry, in Canada you've got OFC, and if you're in the US, then you clearly have the FRB and the OCC. The insurance is provincial, so you've got different oversights across the country, and you do as well in the United States. And then as you hit Asia and the European markets, there's even more oversight when it comes to privacy and information. And so a lot of these regulatory forces require you to build a framework that allows you to demonstrate how you comply. You don't want to do privileged access because it's compliant. You want to do privileged access so that you can demonstrate that you feel it's a key control to manage the risk in your organization, and your framework then can outline how those controls align to your regulatory oversight. And that sounds simple, but I can tell you and I can assure you that it's not as easy unless you're willing to sit down and talk about what that framework needs to look like, because if you don't, then you're making technology investments based on audit findings and regulatory findings. And that's a dangerous place to be, because being compliant is different than being safe. The second part of that then, of course, would be your cybersecurity maturity model, and whether or not you start to align that to some of the frameworks that exist today. Many people follow the NIST framework. A lot of people have the red team approaches that allow you to validate the strength of security within your organization. And some follow the model of the Lockheed Martin's kill chain that says, here's the different steps of the threat chain that we can sort of explore to see whether or not we have those types of exposures. If you build that framework and then you align it to your privileged access program, you now change the narrative on what the program itself is supposed to accomplish across the organization. Because you're no longer implementing a technology tool because the security people thought it's a good thing to invest in. You've actually implemented something that your IT risk framework says reduces risk. The businesses now understand they have greater levels of obligations around privileged access, and it becomes baked into their culture. So in the banking industry, you don't have to tell a teller that they shouldn't leave spare cash sitting on the counter when they walk away from their wicket. And it's not because in their job description they're there to protect money and they're there to vault money. Their job description says they're there to help customers and be customer support reps. But they know that it's a good tenet to protect the cash that they have on hand that they share with the customers when they need it, and to protect it when it's not required, and they don't leave it out on the counter. And in cybersecurity, you would want a system administrator that has privileged access accounts to treat that privileged access account as they do with the money sitting on a counter. And that's a cultural behavior. That's a change in the way they think about privileged access. You align that to your risk framework. Now you can demonstrate as you're implementing your program how you're not only investing in controls that enhance the security and align to a NIST framework or your cybersecurity framework. It also allows you to demonstrate how you've continued to reduce risk on your timelines based on your milestones and the way that your business case then outlined what you're going to do over the next 2 to 3 years or however long your program runs. And what's fundamentally important in this is that you develop strong metrics and reporting around those accomplishments. The biggest challenge that we have today in today's industry with today's risk culture is they always want you to demonstrate what the tangible value is associated with implementing a security product. And that's really tough to do. Operational risk talks about this thing called risk tolerance and risk appetite. Because in the financial world, you can define that. You can define money, right? You can define how much you're willing to spend, how much you're willing to wage, how much you're willing to earn back, what you think your positions and your margin needs to be. When it comes to security, it's a lot more difficult because you can't always anticipate how bad a breach could be based on that breach itself. So you have to get ahead of it, define the metrics, define reporting, define your risk framework so that as you're implementing your tool set, it's not just about the products that you've implemented. It's not just about having your vaults implemented or your proxy services implemented, your jump services implemented on Unix services, on Windows services, on database services. It's all about the business risks that you continue to mitigate as a result of your implementation plan. So let's talk about that. So if we talk about a migration path, which is really what I call the operational excellence. This is really the program management associated, and I say program management. I did not say project management, because this isn't a project, this is a program. This takes a long time, and it's important that you level set expectations within the business when you embark upon this type of program. And again, it's making sure that the business understands this is an organizational problem, it's not a security problem. And I feel I'm preaching to the converted on that, but it's always worth saying. And so it goes without saying that to implement something successful in a program, you need strong program management. And you need to make sure that you've got the right leadership in place that can navigate a very complex organization. And the model and the method that you have to have is really what we call the one team approach. And that you create a steering and executive oversight that brings together all the major constituents of change. It can't be the cybersecurity people reporting on status when you don't have different entities within your own organization at the table feeling the same accountability. You might have a product, a software product that you buy from a service or a vendor. You may in fact have an integrator that comes in and helps you with the implementation strategy. You may also find yourself having to create relationships with the CTOs of your organization because those are the technology people that are implementing the changes. Because as I said earlier, many of you in the room that have cybersecurity programs don't own the screwdriver, right? You influence other parts of the organization. This has to be one team. They have to be at the table. They all have to make sure that they're governing by the same principles and that they understand that everybody around that table has the same accountability when they go to bed at night. They worry about the same things and they have the same level of priorities. And so when you're having your steering committees and you're an executive oversight, and by the way, when you have an executive oversight, you clearly want to bring to the table your CTO as much as your CISO. Because there's no more fun than watching a CISO smile at a CTO that hasn't been able to deliver on a commitment or an accountability. And when they have that type of pressure, then you'll find that the prioritization changes with the support people that are responsible for implementing the tool set. It makes it an easier discussion. If you don't, then you're like the next in line. And that's a really difficult thing to do because an investment like this isn't something that you can afford to have timelines slip because you've got support teams that aren't delivering against the milestones that you had to define. The partnership in one team entity is fundamentally 100% one of the most important things that you could look at. And as you clearly walk through this, you also have to consider when you have strong leadership and you have one team and you've got unilateral commitment at the table from all the different support teams, you want to think about how you want to structure your steering committees around this as well, because what tends to happen is there's just a lot of whining at steering committees if it's not effective. In fact, my experience in the past has been to create just a one-page steering committee deck. And the reason that is because I have sat through, in 35 years, I've had the benefit of sitting through a lot of steering committee meetings, and some of which have been very productive, and some of which I was trying to pierce my eyeballs with a sharp instrument because I just couldn't live through the continuous diatribes that will tend to take place if there isn't structure in place. And the other thing to remember is when you have senior executives at a table and you're sort of walking through what it takes to implement this strategy itself, you have to remember that they're probably multitasking 60,000 different thoughts in their head. And you want to make sure that you are creating the format that has them walking away with the same thought process that you want them to think about, and you have to define those. A multi-page deck in a steering committee is going to make them walk away with the assumptions and the conclusions they draw, not the ones that you want to draw for them. A one-page steering committee, and I called it a placemat, is something that allows you to sort of structure the conversation. Here's the things we've accomplished and they went well. Here are the things that we need to get some executive oversight around. We're not getting traction on some things. Let's be honest, let's be transparent. Let's make sure we have the right people around the table prioritizing what needs to take place for that to execute successfully. And then lastly, it's what are the things that we think we can do strategically to help benefit this project. And the other thing I would also say is, and at the risk of insulting everybody in this room, I'm going to say it anyway because I insult myself. Technology people are the worst marketing people in the world, right? We're horrible at it. And so we spend more time worrying about the next thing that has to be fixed than the accomplishments that we actually stood in front of and brought value to the organization we work in. And when you run a program like Privileged Access, you'll have a standard set of strategies and objectives that you're going to fulfill. But along the way, you're going to uncover a lot of stuff. You're going to uncover stuff that may not be directly associated with your program, but needs to be fixed and drives better security for the organization in general. A steering committee deck is the perfect place to say, by the way, as an extension to what we did, not only have we hit our targets, not only have we deployed across the base of services we said we would, and reduced the risk based on our IT risk strategy that's informed the milestones that we've defined, we've also uncovered these other issues that we've actually cleaned up and have created a better experience for the organization. We've either made things simpler, we've automated processes, we've created better efficiencies, or we've reduced risk. And even if it is not tangible, even if it isn't tangibly linked to the program itself, these are things that you have to sort of talk about and highlight because these give you credibility. And credibility really goes a long way in helping to get executive oversight to continue with your implementation plan. So I now ordain you as like the best marketing people in the world because that's what we have to become. It is all about establishing credibility and becoming the best salespeople for the work that we're doing because that's in fact what gets people's attention. And then lastly, and I don't want to put too fine a point on what I call a comprehensive engagement model. This is organizational change management. And I want to be clear, project management does not always contemplate organizational change management in the way that it should. And in fact, organizational change management is a lot more than, just yelling out a bunch of notes, sending a bunch of emails, and then disciplining people that don't follow the play card. That's not the way organizational change management works. And so there's a number of factors, I think, that lead to a successful change management orchestration. And the reason I think that's important is because a program will come in and they'll implement. A program has a start date and end date and a series of milestones that jiggle somewhere in between. Organizational change management is the transformation piece. It says, how do we operate when the project is done? How do we make sure we have a place where people continue to remain vigilant around privileged access, that they don't continue to find back doors? They find that they're now empowered to think like a security practitioner and that a year or 2 years from your implementation, you're running the same efficiencies in your deployment that you were hoping for when the project was in place and when they completed and wrapped up, wound up, and moved away. And so there's a couple of things to consider when you go through this. Lunch and Learns help bring the people together. All your system administrators need to understand why they're doing this. And it's interesting because what you're going to find is, number one, There'll be stronger buy-in if they understand why you're asking them to do something. If you really sit down and you talk about the cybersecurity landscape, and you don't even have to do any research, just pick up a newspaper on the way into work, you'll probably find a new headline. And the other part of it is why it needs to change, and the fact that they're vulnerable, and the fact that they're targets will make them want to join. In all honesty, it'll make them want to participate and become more advocates of the program than worrying about the change this affects. Training sessions, playbooks, guides, everything needs to be in place that can help them understand how to orchestrate their change, what they need to do, and how to move forward on their system administrative activities, because you've actually disrupted the way they do business, and you've changed the model and how they actually are structured, and you've changed how they do their system administration, and you've actually changed the way in which they commit to their service levels. It's not an easy thing for them to do, and so they need to be part of it along the way and need to help them understand that. Change agents within your organization, so people that represent different pockets and use cases of your implementation strategy. And so, for instance, you'll have different Unix-type use cases across your base. You'll have Windows users across your base. And you'll also have database administrators that all of them have different ways of doing business. And having change agents that are representatives of those groups that actually sit at the table and understand how these changes are going to affect them. And it's bi-directional. Not only are you asking them to help your system administrators understand how this changes, they're actually providing feedback on unique use cases that you may not have contemplated in your program. And it goes a long way when they know they've provided insight, you've actually changed the program and rolled it out. To them, that becomes more of a partnership than them becoming victims of your implementation. And that's a huge win that, from an industry perspective, we've seen a lot of success in. And you can't over-communicate this. So newsletters that talk about accomplishments, what they've done, how they've done their activities, what made them successful, thanking people that have highlighted issues in some of their roles that you may not have contemplated, but ultimately ended up remediating, and they were able to see some changes and they became successful. That's significant, and in fact would provide a lot more buy-in from the people that felt that life all of a sudden was disrupted all over them. And then lastly, I would say that giving them a white glove approach, making sure you had hotlines set up so that when you're going through a major implementation over the course of a couple of weeks, and because be clear about something. This is going to be incredibly disruptive. The way they did system administration tasks, if you're implementing a product, that in fact will change the way they log into the systems to do their work, and they're not any longer, in many cases, seeing passwords anymore. It's just a pass-through when they log in, and they now have dual-factor authentication they may not have had before. All these things change, and your system administrators don't always like change. It's not something they embrace, which is ironic, but it's true. And so having a way that you can sort of give them the instructions they need, give them the guidance, change agents that can help them understand where we're going, the journey, what changes, how it changes, and a place to be able to report problems and have people that are receptive to those problems and can remediate them quickly is fundamentally important in this particular case. And so when you have hotlines that are ready to take calls, when you go through a major implementation, so they have somebody to phone, they have somebody to talk to, they're struggling, the risk of not having this in place, any of this, is that system administrators may then find alternative ways to get access to the services and circumvent the controls that you've implemented. And so you have to find a way to make sure that they understand they're as obligated to fulfill service and security requirements as they are to fulfill their service level agreements. And so these are steps that give them the white glove approach, but there's also an accountability. There's discussions with HR. There's a need to make sure that their roles are well defined and understood and how they're responsible for the security of their credentials. You will find that with all of those together, they will adapt a new philosophy and a new change for privileged access management going forward. And that's an essential step in creating success. Otherwise, they find ways to circumvent. And so really to sort of wind this up, a lot of information, a lot of data, there's really 4 key principles that I call a call to action. First and foremost, PAM is a business and IT risk program. There is no question. The technology will enhance the capability. It will enable you to implement stronger, tighter security controls. But at the end of the day, you're changing business processes, you're changing organizational models. People, as you do your assessment at the beginning of your program, you might find that in some cases, I've seen industries where your system administrators actually were the ones granting privileged access. And you may look at that and say, we need to consolidate this as one service entity before we even implement a control, so that we understand that we actually have control over what's being implemented and we have the central governance point. It is a business problem and it is complex, so don't underestimate the impact it has to an organization. Privileged access management, the business processes, the models, the methodologies, the change to your operating model, and the technology itself is incredibly disruptive. You're impacting all of your system administrators. Don't underestimate the impact that will have on your system administrators. Use organizational change management discipline to bring them to the table. Make sure they're a partner. Make sure they understand why this is important. Nobody wants to be a target. Nobody wants to be told that you have the most powerful credentials in the organization. And if those credentials get compromised or abused, the organization, the enterprise in general, is now compromised. That is not something any individual system administrator wants to take home with them at the end of the day. And so the greater the partnership and the greater the role that they play in helping to define the orchestration of the program, the more likelihood you're going to have buy-in. And by the way, there's going to be a point where you have to, stop dancing in the ring and draw the first punch. There's going to be administrators that, despite their information, their knowledge, the hand-holding, the white glove approach, they still are dissenters. They do not want to comply. And then you have to have some difficult conversations with HR, because there isn't a role for them in an organization when you're honoring them with the most privileged access and they still don't feel the need not to abuse the privilege that they have. You need to consider the journey. Project management is your disruptor. It will disrupt your entire operating model, as well as the implementation of the products that you're looking at and the operational models that are impacted as a result of the business processes that change. And organizational change management will create sustainability. Once the project is done and it's gone, then your organizational change management is what you'd have to rely on to make sure that the culture is maintained, the business processes are sustained, and the operating model itself continues to thrive. I've often heard that some of the best project management implementation success stories are ones where you don't remember the project itself. Because those are the ones that you reflect back and you say, well, here's the things that went wrong, here's what didn't happen. A good organizational change management will rely on a project management team to enable the change to your operating model, but you no longer have to worry about it because you've changed the culture of your organization. And this is fundamental in terms of success. And then, of course, lastly, align it to your IAM strategy. I've said this earlier. This is really all about identity and access management. It's just privileged access individuals, your system administrators, have a higher level of entitlements that are far more pervasive for the organization. But it can't be left alone, and it can't be managed or guided by something unique. It has to be connected to your overall strategy. And if you don't, then you find that disconnect is going to create a situation where your organization is managing two different businesses that will often conflict with each other. And so it has to be part of your IAM strategy. So again, when you're thinking about privileged access management, it's not a technology solution, it's a business problem. It's a change to your operating model and your business processes. It requires strong project management, but at the same time, it also requires strong change management that allows you to implement the changes to your operating model that sustain the culture of how people identify with privileged access. If I'm a system administrator 2 years down the line from the change, I'm no longer the person that says, I need to do what I need to do, however I need to do it, to either maintain the service, make the change, or recover my services. And I don't care about the security people, I'm going to do what I need to do. When that conversation changes, when that narrative changes, then your system administrator is saying, I'm responsible for this idea. I've been giving a master key to this building, and I'm going to make sure I protect it with everything I have. I'll follow the processes. And by the way, these are also the people that will come back and say, geez, I don't know why the organization has allowed me to survive so long with this type of access. I've been telling them for years that this needs to change. I have got more than I need, but nobody's ever listened. And so now they understand that the business is trying to protect them. The organization wants to protect the system administrators. We don't want them to be targets. And at the same time, we empower them to become our security practitioners. We ordain them to become evangelists of security. So while they're doing their work, they're mindful of the security things that they think can create vulnerabilities. And when they become part of that discussion, you've created a successful culture that goes long beyond the technology that enables the controls. It becomes a culture where people realize they need to protect the assets of the organization. It's more than this privileged access. It's the assets that drive our business. And it's the assets that the bad guys target when they're trying to invoke breaches against our exploits and vulnerabilities. And that then creates a strategy around a PAM implementation. And with that, I thank you for your time.